She is not the only one to be mistaken in her judgments. The facts were falsified, even in the most insignificant details. It was said that when the emperor spoke to women, he did so curtly and in rude terms. It is true that he made them feel uncomfortable, but it was on account of his unexpected questions, which it embarrassed them to answer. Yet he never did more than make a mild witticism even to those who had made remarks about him and deserved a reproof. He would step up to them and say smilingly, "And how is the tongue wagging today?" The emperor thought that woman's sole interest was, and should be, how she was dressed. Women's influence in any other field of activity annoyed him. Consequently, at the state receptions, the few words he said to them always referred to that subject. "How becomingly you are dressed. Is that the latest fashion? With that helmet-shaped hat, you resemble the goddess Minerva. You look like a shepherdess or the wife of a sultan today." Once when I was present, he said to the wife of an ambassador, "It seems to me that your wreath of roses and your red sash don't go together. The combination does not conform to the laws of dress." The lady, much embarrassed, did not know what to say. When the reception was over, I reproached the emperor for having upset her. "Was I not right?" he answered. "Yes, but she will take the matter to heart and feel very much hurt over it." "You do not understand such matters, my daughter. Do you mean to say you do not know that women are always pleased at being noticed, even though one criticizes them a little?" Perhaps he was wrong in this. I am inclined to think so, but I am simply explaining his point of view and the reason for which he was feared, fears which expressed themselves by declaring that he was a man who could say only disagreeable things to women. A more justly founded charge was that of being too violent in his expressions, but this never amounted to those bursts of rage which people talked about. These were the two occasions in which I saw him the most wrought up about anything. Once it was against his uncle, Cardinal Fesch. The matter under discussion related to the affairs of the church. The emperor considered it ridiculous for people to be obliged to pay for the sacraments, but admitted that the priests were not well off. "There is only one thing to do. Introduce the tithing system again," declared the cardinal. On hearing these words, the emperor lost his temper. As a member of the emperor's family, although lacking his intelligence and force of character, the cardinal considered he had a right to his own point of view. The emperor, greatly annoyed that one of his relatives should suggest something so contrary to his whole system of government, strode up and down, and taking his snuff box in his hands, dashed it violently to the floor, then left the room. This was the only sign of rage he gave. Another time when my husband was obstinately opposing the emperor's plan to unite Flushing and Nimeguen to France, the emperor delivered a tirade against the Dutch, calling them a nation of petty tradespeople who had sold themselves to England. In his rage, he used a number of insulting epithets. My husband, after having held his own for some time, finally said calmly, "If you have such a poor opinion of the Dutch, why do you want to make them your subjects?" This remark quieted the emperor immediately. He pinched the king's ear and went out. Nothing more was said about the matter. Much has been said in regard to the emperor's way of looking at people, and what a piercing glance he had. No matter how deeply hidden a secret might be, he seemed to be able to discern it. This was absolutely true. How could you keep a secret from someone who, when he looked at you, seemed to know all about it? At the same time, as everybody felt embarrassed and uneasy when in his presence, it was difficult for him to discover a man's real character. He managed to find out what people sought to conceal, but not what they really were. Only when you trust someone do you display your true nature. It was part of the emperor's policy to gather about him men of ability, irrespective of their political ideas. In order to do this, he knew so well how to make himself agreeable that it was hard to resist him. The Comte de Lally-Tollendal, who by his eloquence had redeemed his father's memory, had nevertheless not been able, on account of political events, to regain possession of his father's estates, which had been sequestered. Shortly before the marriage of his daughter, who had been brought up with me by Madame Campan at Saint-Germain, Monsieur de Lally Tollendal, having no dowry to give her, wrote the first consul about it. The consul granted him 150,000 francs. Monsieur de Lally Tollendal went to Saint Cloud to express his thanks and received a cordial reception. The consul said to him, "I cannot conceive why, having taken a brilliant part in the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly and not having compromised himself in any of the bloody excesses which later took place, Monsieur de Lally does not do his share in serving the interests of regenerated France." The count replied, "The King of England saved me from the great danger I was in during the Revolution by claiming I was an English gentleman. Since then, I have received an allowance from that monarch. Can I be like the bat in the fable who declared, according to circumstances, 'I am a bird, look at my wings. I am a mouse, look at my fur'?" "But," answered the consul, "in what language was it that you defended your father? In what language did you defend your king?" "In French." "Then, Mr. de Lally, you should realize that we always belong to a country in whose language we have expressed such noble sentiments." This is an example of the way in which the emperor knew on appropriate occasions how to make the most flattering and agreeable remarks. But Monsieur de Lally, although much touched, persisted in his refusal to take a government post, but remained perfectly quiet either in Paris or on his son-in-law's estate near Bordeaux. How can we expect it to believe people who, after having faithfully served a man so appreciative of their talents and capacities, suddenly denied that they had ever acted of their own free will and complained of having been forced to adopt a line of conduct which they themselves decided on? But such things would be expected. A new dynasty is always criticized, and still more severely if it is overthrown. Small-minded people always use insults as a means both of justifying their past conduct and of securing future advancement. Both these things happen in our case. I had reached the point of not worrying so much about all the absurd tales that were told about me. I could do nothing in regard to them. It was part of a deliberate plan. Even my mother's name, which until then had been respected, was now the subject of ridiculous anecdotes. A woman who pretended to be an adept at sorcery went so far as to make up a completely untrue and improbable set of memoirs about her. Sometimes, too, a series of letters said to have been written by her would make its appearance. The foreigners also, on their own account, went about collecting stories of obviously improbable incidents. These stories they would publish and pretend to think them true. A clever man to whom I one day spoke of how annoyed I was to see the public continue to be interested in my fair set. "You cannot expect it to be otherwise. It is because of your lofty rank. Whether you do something or remain quiet, whether your behavior is admirable or the reverse, does not alter the matter. As long as people believe that on account of your former connections you may still be dangerous, they will fear you and be curious about you." I was struck by the truth of this remark, and it made me still more indifferent to what was said about me. Then, too, temporary unpopularity is not worth worrying about. As time goes on, one may hope to be judged impartially. Death brings us a step nearer to this final verdict, and knowing it is bound to come at last, we can bear the present with resignation. Everywhere I went, it was curiosity rather than sympathy that caused most people to want to know me. I was often amused to see how entirely people's opinions changed as soon as they had actually seen me. Several persons admitted this to me afterwards. A queen who is said to have been closely involved in great events, the stepdaughter and stepsister of the greatest general the world has ever known, must, so people think, be capable of putting herself at the head of an army and leading troops into battle the way Jeanne d'Arc and Jeanne de Montfort did. People imagine her tall, robust, and dark, with a proud, hard face and strongly modeled features, and they found themselves in front of a feeble, thin, blonde woman whose face bore the marks of sorrow still more clearly than those of time. As I have already said, I owed many friends to the fact that people had been prejudiced against me in advance. Therefore, I ought not to complain. If I had had the misfortune to be born to a crown, I could have hoped to preserve only supporters. As it is, I now possess friends. These persons who came to like me, after at first being merely curious about me, are the ones to whom I felt I must make myself better known through these memoirs. I had never thought of writing my memoirs. Only after the emperor's divorce, when I heard someone blaming my brother for having agreed to it, I realized how difficult it is for truth to become widely known. In a few moments, I had noted down all the details of this event, and that was all the writing I had ever done. Madame la Comtesse de Nansouty, an exceedingly clever woman, was at Aix-la-Chapelle when I was there in 1812. She was very anxious to have me write the story of my life. I assured her repeatedly I should never have patience enough to do so. Well then, just tell it to me, she said, and I will write it all down as we go along. The next day, indeed, she brought me an account of some incidents of my childhood which I had told her the day before. But they were too cleverly written. It did not sound like me. Although quite willing to admit the excellence of this system, I confessed that I did not care to hear myself speaking in any other voice than my own. The book never got any further than the first page, which she kept. Now in a perfectly tranquil spot, my heart and head still full of the events which have just taken place. I have tried to sort them out. It has not been difficult. Truth is always easy to tell. When one does not have to try to construct a plot, anyone is clever enough to relate just what happened. I had so often been obliged to examine all my past actions that my entire life was vividly present in my mind. It was easy enough to recall my feelings on different occasions. This habit of dwelling on what occurred in the past, had a great deal to do with keeping my grief unassuaged. But as I wrote on, I felt a sensation of relief come over me, as though the weight of the past, which had so long oppressed my mind and spirits, was gradually diminishing. It seemed as if I were confiding my troubles to a friend, and I already began to experience that forgetfulness of our ills, which generally only time can bring. The trouble with memoirs generally is that they do not give a clear enough idea of our social position and the nature of our relations to those in power. Personal vanity causes us always to try to make ourselves unduly important as, for instance, when we pose as having given advice on occasions when we merely obeyed someone else's instructions. As far as I am concerned, although I saw a great deal of the emperor, I should be entirely wrong if I said I ever had the least influence over him. While I really did consider myself as his daughter, I, like everyone else, was so much in awe of him that I rarely ventured to address him unless he spoke first, and my replies were frequently confused. He even said to me one day, "People tell me you are clever. I don't know anything about it. I always feel as though you were 10 years old." It is the same with Eugène. I have never been able to get used to hearing him reason about something logically. And the emperor added, "That is the trouble with parents when they get old. They can never realize that children grow up, and sometimes could actually teach them a lesson." My mother was the only person I ever saw who was entirely at her ease with the emperor, the only one who had the slightest influence over him, and this was only in minor matters. In my solitude at Augsburg, my days were so peaceful and quiet that my health began to improve. In order to live on, I required a life free from all sensations, even those of happiness. Perhaps the latter would have killed me. I was satisfied to be able to recall the past without regret. Then, too, close at hand, I had the best of consolations, my brother, who frequently came over from Munich to see me. With such a friend, life still was worth living. I also received frequent letters from Monsieur de Flahaut. They always contained expressions of the warmest friendship, the most perfect admiration. He had married the young woman who had given him such a cordial welcome in England. He was happy, and his happiness was dear to me because I felt I was at least partly responsible for it. For a long while, I had not known how to write him in a natural manner. Little by little, I conquered my reserve by the thought that in him I possessed a true friend, someone who knew me better than anybody else did, and whose solicitude would reward me for all the pain hostile criticism had caused me. The barrier which separated us safeguarded my peace of mind. All that was left of the romantic side of my nature was the need of constantly perceiving nobility in the soul of others. The only thing which affected me were accounts of some heroic action. I was inclined to think that all those who were attracted to me must possess lofty ideals, and although opportunity for intrigue sometimes attracts people as much as sympathy with misfortune, I was never mistaken in my intuitions. I had had too much experience. When a person has suffered much himself and become aware of the intensity of human emotions through having either yielded to or curbed his own impulses, he knows the secrets of the human heart by what his own has endured. Frequently, the heart teaches us more than the most subtle mind could grasp. I also read a great deal. In order to enjoy a book, I had to find in its descriptions of the better elements of human nature rather than its weaknesses. I preferred Rousseau weeping over misfortunes which never took place to Voltaire launching his epigrams at both the just and the unjust. I enjoyed the madness of Don Quixote and the common sense of Sancho more than the brilliant and yet depressing picture of society so admirably drawn in Gil Blas. I had to have something that appealed to my emotions. Doubtless it was my heart that required nourishment rather than my brain. I also enjoyed authors who provoked reflection. La Bruyere, Massillon, Pope, Plato, The Imitation of Christ, all those works which fostered and encouraged the purity and elevation of the soul charmed me more and more each day. But the most delightful occupation of all was the education of my youngest son, who spent most of his time with me, while his elder brother was in Italy with his father. I paid especial attention to his moral education. A man can teach good things. A woman inspires them. Her words penetrate more deeply. What comes from the heart enters another heart more readily. I will stop here. There is nothing left to tell. As I look back over my life, the spectacle I contemplate no longer pains me. Entirely absorbed by my duties toward my husband, I had hoped to find my happiness in pleasant domestic life. Alas, I was sorely mistaken. I sought refuge in his sincere affection. I thought that in order to be happy, one need only to be loved, and that a pure and tender attachment formed life's fairest jewel. Again, I was wrong. Perfection is not to be found in a human heart, and I sought it in vain. Public admiration seemed to me for a moment to be a compensation. That, too, was taken from me, and I was obliged to steel my heart against this new blow. I felt I had counted too much on human gratitude, and from then on I decided to do good without expecting any in return. Having been disappointed in everything, I shall seek to create my own happiness without counting on anything or anybody else. I shall love my fellow beings. I shall do what I can to help them. I shall expect no gratitude. In the past, I hoped in vain to obtain some appreciation. The sight of unhappiness and distress will always attract me, and if I can soothe it, I shall do so. That is the true perfect joy, since it is something no one can take from us. I therefore believe I have found the real road to happiness, and I look forward to the future with serenity. Although I am alone, exiled from my home, mourning the terrible fate of the benefactor of my family, I often say to myself, my life, however, is over. No longer need I fear passions. I have conquered them. No longer do I fear misfortune. I am able to bear it. And if I have found a way in which to be quieter and to improve, what else can I hope for myself? Only this, that I may live a little longer in the memory of my dear compatriots, in the hearts of my friends, and at last die in the arms of my children. Such is my last wish.